In the quiet aftermath of World War II, as the world began stitching its wounds, the United States stood at a crossroads between withdrawal and dominance. In the Middle East, the echoes of colonial retreat left a vacuum, and in that vacuum, oil gushed and empires reconfigured. American policymakers, once wary of overseas entanglements, now calculated in barrels and battlefields. Among them was George McClintock, a mid-level diplomat with a keen eye and a penchant for silence. Stationed in Cairo in 1947, he watched as British authority waned and a new kind of influence, American, economic, elusive, began its quiet rise. George's reports were methodical, often buried beneath larger headlines in Washington. But one phrase recurred often: Strategic Petroleum Corridor. It referred not to a highway, but to a fragile chain of alliances stretching from the sands of Arabia to the refineries of Basra. The United States didn't need to plant flags. It needed to secure flow of oil, of stability, of allegiance. That flow would define the century. Far from Cairo in Tehran, another man felt the weight of this flow more personally. Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist with a scholar's mind and a revolutionary's fire, had risen to prominence by questioning a simple premise. Why should foreigners profit from Iranian oil while Iranians lived in poverty? His voice, erudite and unwavering, captured a nation tired of watching its wealth fuel empires. By 1951, he became prime minister. Within months, he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, setting off alarms in London and in Langley, Virginia. The CIA had been born in war, but its first major peacetime operation would be fought in the bazaars of Tehran. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore and fluent in subtle manipulation, arrived in Iran under the guise of a cultural attaché. His mission, cloaked in Cold War rhetoric, was simple: remove Mossadegh, restore the Shah, and protect Western oil interests. Democracy, sovereignty, self-determination. These were luxuries, negotiable in the shadow of Soviet expansion. Roosevelt's plan was elegant in its chaos: pay mobs to riot, bribe newspapers to print lies, sway military officers with briefcases of cash. Mossadegh, principled and increasingly isolated, underestimated the speed of deception. By August 1953, the streets of Tehran erupted. Soldiers loyal to the Shah stormed government buildings. The prime minister, confused but calm, surrendered. He would die under house arrest, a footnote in the grand narrative of containment. Back in Washington, the coup was deemed a success. Oil flowed. The Shah, now secure, signed new agreements favorable to the West. But a seed had been planted in Iranian memory, one of betrayal, imperial arrogance, and the fickle nature of American friendship. In Riyadh, a younger man watched these events unfold from behind palace curtains. Crown Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia, austere and cautious, understood the balance between reverence and survival. The Americans offered wealth, protection, and the promise of modernization. In return, they asked only for access: military bases, oil concessions, strategic alignment. Faisal, shaped by tribal diplomacy and Islamic conservatism, saw the future unfolding on foreign blueprints. By the early 1960s, the Americans were everywhere, training pilots in Jordan, building airstrips in Dhahran, embedding advisors in Baghdad. Yet for all their presence, they rarely understood the pulse of the people. In Cairo, Nasser's fiery speeches against Western imperialism echoed across transistor radios. In Damascus and Beirut, students marched with slogans that blended nationalism with socialism. American officials dismissed them as Soviet pawns, unable or unwilling to see the deeper truth. The region was awakening, and it did not want to be ruled by proxies. George McClintock, now posted in Ankara, began noticing a change in tone. His cables grew more uncertain. "We are investing in regimes, not peoples," he wrote. The hearts may be lost before the war begins. His words were filed, unread by those who preferred graphs to grief. Then came 1967. The Six-Day War shattered illusions of regional balance. Israel, with tacit American support, defeated 3 Arab armies and claimed swaths of territory. For many in the Middle East, it confirmed a suspicion long whispered: America was not neutral. It had chosen a side, and that side did not wear a keffiyeh. Riots erupted in Amman. Embassies were torched in Tripoli. Young men, once hopeful for reform, turned to militancy. And yet, amid the anger, American oil companies signed record deals. In places like Kuwait and Qatar, glass towers rose above sand, fueled by petrodollars and guarded by foreign arms. In a small office in Langley, a new file was opened. Emerging Threats, Middle East. It spoke not of armies or tanks, but of ideology. Islamic revivalism, anti-Western sentiment, radical nationalism. The names would change over the years. Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, but the roots were already visible. By 1973, the pattern had fully crystallized. When the Yom Kippur War brought the world to the brink, Arab nations responded not with tanks, but with oil embargoes. Gas stations in America saw lines stretch for miles. Suddenly, the region's value was no longer abstract. It was visceral, strategic, urgent. In the halls of the White House, Henry Kissinger spoke of realpolitik. Oil was power. Influence was necessity. America would never again risk being shut out. Alliances were cemented not with treaties, but with arms sales and covert guarantees. George McClintock retired in 1975, his final memo unread. It warned of overreach, of relying too heavily on kings and generals, of forgetting that every revolution begins in silence. He died in obscurity, but his fears did not. In Tehran, the Shah celebrated a glittering anniversary of the Persian monarchy with fireworks and feasts. But outside the palace walls, another silence was growing, of clerics, students, laborers. A storm was coming, and it would not be bought off with oil. The foundations were laid. The stakes were rising. America had claimed its foothold in the Middle East. What came next would test the weight of every decision made in back rooms and boardrooms, far from the deserts they hoped to shape. The hum of fluorescent lights flickered above rows of Pentagon analysts in the late summer of 1990. Their screens filled with satellite images of tanks crawling across the Kuwaiti desert. Saddam Hussein, Iraq's belligerent autocrat, had defied decades of Cold War calibration by invading a neighbor the U.S. considered vital to the balance of oil and order. President George H.W. Bush, cautious but resolute, called the act a naked act of aggression. It wasn't just Kuwait on the line. It was the principle that a post-Cold War world must have rules, and America, for better or worse, would enforce them. Colonel David Kendall, a career military strategist with sand still in his boots from Beirut, studied the situation map in silence. He had spent much of the 1980s watching America dance an uneasy waltz in the Middle East, arming Iraq against Iran, supporting Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan, courting Gulf monarchs with fleets and promises. Now he saw those decisions folding back onto themselves. Saddam, once a convenient strongman, had grown too bold. The question was no longer how to stop him, but how much America was willing to spend in blood, treasure, and time. Operation Desert Storm launched in January 1991, a storm of precision-guided missiles and satellite-coordinated assaults that dazzled the world. The war ended quickly, but it did not end cleanly. The U.S. chose not to topple Saddam, fearing a power vacuum more than a dictator. Troops remained in Saudi Arabia, a decision that echoed far beyond policy memos. Among the furious was a man in exile, Osama bin Laden. In the rugged caves of Afghanistan, bin Laden recorded tapes dripping with contempt. He spoke of humiliation, of occupation, of betrayal. To his followers, the presence of American troops near Islam's holiest sites was a provocation beyond tolerance. His language was steeped in theology but burned with politics. America, he declared, would bleed. The Central Intelligence Agency, once again reading shadows, tracked chatter from Yemen to Pakistan. Names surfaced, cells, contacts, funding lines. But the pattern didn't yet seem cohesive. The world had moved on. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union dissolved, and America was unchallenged. President Clinton focused on peace deals and economic growth, not militant ideologues in the mountains. Then, on the bright September morning of 2001, the towers fell, and everything changed. Kendall, pulled from retirement within hours, stood in the Situation Room, watching replay after replay. The smoke rising from Lower Manhattan was not just smoke. It was a new doctrine. President George W. Bush addressed the nation with solemnity, promising justice, security, and resolve. America would go to war, not just with a nation, but with an idea. The War on Terror was born. Afghanistan became the first battleground. The Taliban, who had given sanctuary to bin Laden, were overthrown swiftly, but victory on the battlefield blurred into the murk of occupation. Special forces conducted night raids, drones buzzed constantly above mud-walled villages. There were victories. Yes, training camps destroyed, leaders captured, but each success birthed a new generation of enemies. War, it turned out, had no clear endpoint when the enemy did not wear uniforms or hold borders. Back in Washington, debate simmered around a different threat: Iraq. Intelligence, shaky and contorted, pointed to weapons of mass destruction. Vice President Dick Cheney, certain and unswerving, lobbied for action. In Baghdad, Saddam remained defiant, a ghost from an unfinished war. By 2003, American tanks again rolled toward him, not to contain, but to remove. Major Rachel Voss, a military intelligence officer, entered Iraq days after the first airstrikes. She believed in the mission. Saddam was brutal, his prisons filled with corpses and silence. But as the statue of the dictator fell in Firdos Square, she noticed something else: looters stripping government offices bare, militias organizing in the alleys, whispers of sectarian revenge. The regime was gone, but there was no plan for what came next. The insurgency erupted like a disease in a vulnerable host. Sunni extremists attacked American convoys. Shia militias, emboldened by Iranian support, filled power vacuums with checkpoints and executions. Baghdad became a city of walls and curfews. Voss sent reports daily, warning that every heavy-handed raid created more insurgents than it killed. Her superiors nodded but offered no alternative. Back home, Americans watched the war blur. The mission shifted from liberation to stabilization to survival. The media turned. Body counts replaced victory metrics. By 2007, the surge, a gamble of additional troops and revised strategy, briefly stemmed the chaos. But the damage was lasting. The war's legitimacy frayed, its goals unclear. Meanwhile, the conflict metastasized. Detainees from Guantanamo spoke of torture and indefinite imprisonment. Contractors replaced soldiers in dangerous zones. Afghanistan, once considered the good war, stagnated as the Taliban regrouped and corruption festered. In the background, bin Laden remained elusive. For a decade, his name haunted American policy like a ghost in every briefing room. Then, in 2011, a raid in Abbottabad brought his end. President Obama announced the success with controlled pride. It was a symbolic victory. But by then, the war had moved far beyond one man. The Arab Spring erupted months later, toppling regimes and unleashing suppressed voices. In Libya, Syria, Bahrain, new conflicts emerged, entangled with old alliances. And in Iraq, the departure of U.S. troops left a fragile government and simmering resentments. From those ashes, something darker rose: the Islamic State. a group more brutal, more theatrical, and more globally connected than Al-Qaeda. It stormed across borders, declared a caliphate, and drew recruits from Paris to Jakarta. America returned to the region once again, not with invasions, but with airstrikes, special operations, and uneasy coalitions. Colonel Kendall, older now, watched the news in silence. He saw cities like Mosul fall and retaken. He heard speeches recycled from his younger days. And he asked the same question he'd asked after Kuwait. How much longer? In quiet corridors, Rachel Voss filed her resignation. She had seen too many plans written in ink and erased in blood. "We tried to fight an idea with force," she told a colleague, "and forgot the people caught between them." The wars had expanded, fragmented, and transformed. But the central conflict remained, a superpower reaching across oceans, trying to shape a region whose history defied control. The dust had not settled, the cost had not been counted, and the next chapter was already gathering in the wings. The desert city of Raqqa burned in silence as the last Islamic State flag was torn from a government building. The caliphate, once a sprawling menace spanning Syria and Iraq, was territorially defeated. Yet, for intelligence officer Amina Reed, stationed at a temporary base outside Mosul, victory felt incomplete. The battlefield had changed, but the war, the deeper war for hearts, futures, and meaning, raged in different forms. Beneath the rubble lay the real question. What had all the fighting forged, and what had it broken? Amina had spent her adult life tracing American footsteps through the region. She arrived in Iraq as a young analyst in 2004, chasing insurgent chatter. She left in 2011 as a disillusioned believer. When ISIS emerged from the chaos America thought it had left behind, she returned, not out of duty, but out of unfinished reckoning. Now, in 2019, she scanned reports detailing foreign fighters trying to return home, orphaned children in camps, communities too shattered to rebuild. The enemy no longer wore uniforms or lived in caves. It existed in algorithms, memories, and the cracked promises of too many wars. In Washington, the narrative had shifted. Administrations came and went, each pledging a different approach: withdraw, stabilize, pivot, recalibrate. But the region refused to be rewritten on American timelines. In Yemen, the Saudis fought a proxy war against Iranian-backed Houthis, with American weapons and quiet complicity. In Syria, Kurdish allies who had bled alongside U.S. troops found themselves abandoned to geopolitical bargains. And in Iran, assassinations and sanctions teetered on the edge of open conflict. Yet the appetite for engagement dwindled. War fatigue had seeped into the American psyche like groundwater. Veterans returned with scars both seen and hidden, and the public asked whether decades of conflict had made anyone safer. In press briefings and political rallies, phrases like "forever wars" and "nation-building fatigue" were used like punctuation, but few dared to ask what staying away might cost. Sergeant Malik Hart, recently redeployed to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, saw the war through different eyes. His father had served in Fallujah. His uncle had died in Kandahar. For Malik, this wasn't history, it was inheritance. He believed in the mission, but he also understood its contradictions. One night, walking beneath the rotating blades of a Chinook, he told Amina over the comms, "We're building sandcastles in a tide zone." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Elsewhere, new battles erupted without warning. In cyberspace, Iranian hackers probed American infrastructure. In Gaza, Israeli strikes echoed with retaliatory force. In Beirut, protesters burned effigies of leaders who had promised change and delivered ruin. In every corner of the region, American fingerprints, visible or hidden, were part of the architecture of power, even if the architects themselves now hesitated to claim responsibility. Back in Langley, a group of junior analysts watched real-time drone footage from northern Syria. The feed was silent, the movement surgical. To them, war was data, streamed, stored, parsed for patterns. Amina, visiting headquarters on a temporary assignment, felt alien among them. They understood the statistics, but not the silence. They could quote kill ratios, but had never held a child who mistook the whine of a surveillance drone for thunder. Still, she did not blame them. Every war has its inheritors. These young minds had grown up with conflict as background noise. Their America had always been at war, though not always paying attention. Their decisions, like those made decades before, would echo across borders they'd never cross. In Baghdad, a new parliament sat amid old ruins. Iraq was a state rebuilt on fragments, Shia dominance, Sunni resentment, Kurdish assertion. American advisors still circled quietly in green zones and training fields. But the future belonged to others now. Young Iraqis, born after the invasion, filled streets with chants and defiance. They wanted jobs, dignity, freedom from corruption, not foreign lectures or foreign troops. The legacy of American war to them was not liberty, but loss. As 2021 approached, President Biden announced the final withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was meant to close a chapter, but Amina knew better. War does not end because a flag is folded or a speech is made. It lingers, in broken homes, in forgotten alliances, in cemeteries that stretch past memory. In Kabul, chaos unfurled as swiftly as silence had fallen in Raqqa. The Taliban returned before the dust could settle. Thousands rushed airport gates. Desperation eclipsed policy. Malik, on temporary assignment to assist evacuation efforts, watched families toss infants to Marines in panic. "This can't be how it ends," he said to no one. But it was. In the months that followed, America turned inward. The economy, the pandemic, political divisions, all seemed more urgent than a distant region it had tried and failed to reshape. But the Middle East did not forget. From Tehran to Tripoli, from Jerusalem to Mosul, people remembered the bombs and promises, the alliances made, the betrayals that followed. Some grieved, others waited. Amina stood one final time at the edge of an airstrip in Erbil, northern Iraq. The sun was rising, painting the horizon in the same red-gold hues she'd seen when she first arrived decades ago. A Kurdish officer stood beside her, silent. They had fought together, lost together. Neither needed to speak. "This place changes you," she finally said. "No," he replied. "It shows you who you are." As the transport lifted into the sky, Amina did not look back. The war was no longer behind her or ahead. It lived within her, a ledger not of victories and defeats, but of truths learned too late. The story of America's wars in the Middle East was not one of conquest or collapse. It was a story of entanglement, of ideals compromised, alliances tested, and lessons deferred. The dust may settle, the troops may leave, but the echo of every decision remains. And somewhere, in a meeting room or a tent or a refugee camp, the next chapter waits, still unwritten.